Today, we're talking about staging. In selecting topics for these 3 webinars, we picked and chose the various things we could look at, and we wanted to have the ones that we felt could be the most impactful. So staging is one of those areas where things can either go very, very good, or they can go, and you would never even know that it was there, or it can go very wrong, and it can infect a race. And in many cases, we as officials leave it to the volunteers. They know what they're doing, they'll get it solved. But if as officials and technical people, if we don't understand how the system should work, we're not going to be able to help them fix things if should something break down. So today we're going to talk about the layout and the features of a staging system. What should it look like? How should it be built? What are some examples of good? We're going to talk about the staging team and their roles. What do they do to facilitate this? And then lastly, we'll just touch on a few best practices, things to look for, things that make a good staging system work well. So to start, we'll talk about this system itself. What should it look like? What is the layout of a staging system? So we're going to talk about what the function of the staging is. What does it need to do? What does it need to be able to provide to the race? We're going to look at the layout of an example of one. There are many examples of good staging systems, but I'll show you some of the key elements and help you identify what is right and what's wrong. And we'll look at some of the critical pieces that make it work. So an efficient and well-run staging system will support the required race pace, and that's maybe the biggest role that we are looking for. Is the staging able to bring the riders from the pits or from the stands, get them put into their heats and get them to the gate in such time that there's always one ready when we're ready to put them on the course. We want to be able to maintain the event schedule. So if staging is falling behind and we're not able to keep running when we need to, we're very much at risk of losing the schedule. And that can be just as simple as it being annoying that we're a little late, or it could mean that we run into weather or other delays that could have been avoided. It's one of the easiest places for us to make sure that racer equipment and clothing meets regulations. They're not racing at full speed through the staging area, or at least they shouldn't be. And we have the opportunity to take a closer look and make sure that things are in the right place. We want to make sure that riders don't miss their motos. You know, we're dealing with ages from 5 to 65 and beyond. We want to make sure that all those riders can get to their race and can find their way there safely. And we also want to make sure that they're in the right heat and the right gate. We want to make sure that their race is valid, that they were able to race what they were told to, and they get to where they need to be. So what do we need to do to make that work? So this is a diagram of a sample staging system. You'll see some of the critical components. That includes a warm-up area, so an area where the riders can roll around in a circle and get their legs warmed up. You can see the pre-staging pens. This is the first area we bring riders into and get them kind of into groups. We have the staging lanes, and so this is where we're getting real now. We're going to put them into heats. We're going to get them lined up. We're going to make sure that we've got them all grouped together. We have the back of the start hill or the buffer area. This is basically the space between where we've taken them from their lanes, where we had them organized, and presented them to the start hill. And then we have basically the gate or just behind the gate. So you've got a moto in the gate ready to go, and typically we would have several motos behind, 1 to 2 or whatever the space allows, to be able to keep the gate dropping at a regular pace. So let's go into those a little bit more detail. So when we talk about a warm-up area, this is the space, that between, say, the pits and the staging area itself, a space where riders can circle around, check their gear, get their last instructions from their coach or their parent. It needs to be relatively close to the pits. It can't be too far away. And ideally, it's that space in between where the pits are and where the staging is. The expectation is the riders are waiting there for their name to be called, or their category to be called, to pre-staging. Pre-staging is going to be a space where ideally we have 2 or more staging pens, as we call them, and these are spaces big enough to bring at least 2 full heats in, or 10 full heats in, sorry. So you're talking up to 80 riders coming into one of those pens. So these are quite large. We'd like to have a controlled entrance so that we have an opportunity to have riders pass by us in smaller groups, maybe one or two, so we can do some of those equipment checks and look over their jerseys and their pants and their bike. We're not doing formal measurements, but we're looking to see if we see anything that's obvious. We need a really good public address system, a speaker, a microphone that we can call out to the crowd into the pits, announcing which category is coming next, what group should be getting ready or getting close, so that when we call them in, that they're ready to go. And sometimes it's helpful to have something like a display board. A dry erase board is really all you need, a simple board with some information on it, telling the riders when the net staging starts. So for round 1, we're going to start staging here. Round 2, we can start here. In the photo in the bottom right, you can see they actually had a digital display board in this event that we were at, where they were actually talking about the motos that were coming up. Now, the picture that I've used throughout this presentation is an example taken from the UCI BMX Commissaire training guide, and it shows 2 pens basically in parallel. So you would load one pen first, and once as you sort with it, you could load the second pen. An alternate arrangement that I've seen quite common is this kind of pen after pen. So the first pen is the pre-staging pen that you bring all the riders into in one big group. You start to kind of get them sorted a little bit and moved into their heats and kind of their grouping, and then you pass them to the second pen where they can continue to be more refined and sorted into those groups. Either is fine, and it's a matter of taking advantage of the space that you have, and we'll talk a little about that later. So the next thing that we roll into is our staging lanes. And so there's a question that comes up quite frequently about this, is how should staging lanes be numbered? So I'll get Andreas to launch that poll and put it up for you guys to look at. So my question is, for the staging lanes, do they need to be numbered 1 to 10, 0 to 9, or doesn't matter, whatever the staging team prefers? Wow, there's some different opinions for sure. I'll get Andreas to put up the poll results. So the vast majority of you prefer 1 to 10. That's my personal preference. But in all actual honesty, it really doesn't matter as long as the staging team understands and the riders can quickly understand. My preference is to go from 1 to 10, and I'll explain why in a minute. So when we talk about the staging lanes, we're talking about individual lanes that are numbered so that we can slot different heats into each one. It's also very useful to have an 11th express lane, a space that allows you to move riders through the area quickly, those that maybe have missed the pre-staging or had a mechanical issue that they needed to get fixed. If we fill the whole width of the space we have with staging lanes, it's really hard to move around. And not only riders need to move through there, but sometimes officials or technical people need to come through, and we need to provide that space. Ideally, the staging lanes are long enough that you can have 2 motos back to back. So in those 10 lanes, we would have 20 heats, right? So we'd have 20 in there, and we'd be able to maintain a high level of efficiency of moving them through. As you can see in these photos, the best practice we recommend is like hard fencing, or the steel fencing with T-bars at the bottom, or I've seen even effectively using cement parking curbs. It's important to make sure that these lines don't move. As you can see, as the riders are waiting, they're leaning on things, they're chatting, they're interacting, and if we're using something as simple as just flagging or ribbon, it breaks down very quickly and can cause a problem. And typically, as we load them into these staging lanes, we're loading them in order of their gate position. So rider that's going to be in gate position 1 goes in first, and he's followed by the other gates that make up his heat or her heat. So talk about the numbering system. This photo was actually taken at the World Championships in Baku, and where you're standing is you're standing at the exit of those staging lanes looking back to the beginning. So the riders would be coming in through that doorway you can see in the back end of the photo. And you can see here you've got motos on either side, or heats on either side. And right down the middle is this express lane we talked about. So this is a path that we can easily get officials and bikes through. And if you're a rider coming from the other side, you'd be presented with a number on your far left. It's our right in this photo, but your far left, it says number 1. So moto number 1 or heat number 1 rolls up, gets slotted down that lane. Heat 2, and so on, gets slotted into each one of those lanes from 1 through to 10. And when they get through to 10 and the 11th heat rolls up, well, they slot into lane 1, right? 12 goes into lane 2. And we can do this all day. Now, like I said, you can label these 0 to 9, meaning that you start by skipping 0 the first time through. 1 goes down lane 1. You get to 9 on the far side of your group, and then 10 comes back and slides down row 0. Either one is fine. Like I said, this is the one that I prefer because as you're starting your day, Moto 1, far left side, right down the end, you don't have to explain that. It makes sense for most people. So once we've got them into these lanes, and you can see we've got some different people, some marshals and volunteers standing here coordinating and controlling. We actually use, in some cases, ropes across the ends of these so we can control when riders come out. So rather than just the riders getting excited and rolling out because they think they should go next, we try to control that by dropping a rope, inviting the heat to come out of that pen and go to the next stage. And so that next stage for most of them, it would be, in most places, is the back of the hill. So we call it a buffer zone or the back of the hill, where the heat is going to roll out of their staging lanes and prepare to walk up the back of the hill. Depending on the layout, depending on the start of the hill, this can be different. So they would exit their staging lane and they would enter this zone. Now, in some cases, the staging lanes of 1 to 10 are maintained on the back of a hill. In the case of the one that we're looking at in the bottom right-hand photo, they actually labeled them 1 to 8. So now instead of being in a long skinny line of a heat going up a single lane, they would actually spread out across this row in their gate positions. So they would find their gate position on the lines. They would then progress up the hill in their heat, in their gate positions. Now, with that, it's important that there's still somebody at the top of that portion confirming that the heat has stayed together. If you have heats where you don't have full gates of 8, it's very easy for riders in the same category to get confused with where their heat is and find themselves rolling into an empty slot. So it's important that there's somebody again at the top before they get released to the gate that's validating that. So at the very top of the start hill, you will have obviously one heat in the gate, either having just left or getting ready to go. And hopefully you have a couple of positions behind the gate for 1 or 2 additional heats. Now in this photo, it's obviously a little bit messy. I believe this was actually a practice that was going on, but you can see that you've got space that you could very neatly line up 2 heats behind the moto and have those riders get ready to go. So it's important that they have their helmet on, their gloves on, their equipment's all been checked, and they're ready to drop into the gate and get going right away. We don't typically have time for them to do all of that while they're sitting in the gate. So we need people at the top here that are monitoring that as well. So in that first section, we had an opportunity to look at the different functions of a staging system. We looked at how the layout should be, a typical one anyways, and some of those elements in greater detail of what makes that staging system work. So I think let's talk about the most important part of a staging system, and those are the people that are actually running it, our staging team. So we're going to talk briefly about the staging team members, who they are, and more importantly, we're going to talk about what their roles are and what we are expected of them to do in order to complete this very important task with keeping our race going. So to start, a staging team needs many people to run efficiently. The more people we have, the greater communication we can maintain with the riders, the the better we can find flaws and errors to correct and make sure things are running smoothly. If we only have one guy back there with a megaphone, they're going to struggle. We need to have a leader of the staging area. This is the person that can coordinate and work with their team and identify things that can go wrong. And they need to be in direct communication with our start commissaire or our COM3. Our start commissaire needs to be aware of how staging is performing, if there's anything that's going wrong, so that they can start to mitigate any problems in advance. But the team leader is the one that's staying on top of that and being able to provide that interaction. The staging team must have effective communication equipment. And by that, I mean not only communication with the riders. So we're talking about speakers, public address systems, megaphones, so that the riders can hear instructions clearly and move through, but also amongst themselves. So if a staging area is large enough that you can't make hand signals or talk to your other stagers, they need to have radios or some way to update each other. A rider's coming through that missed a moto. We've got a problem with a piece of equipment and we might be delayed. Things like that. So the staging team needs to be able to stay in close contact amongst themselves. They need to have accurate moto sheets. We need to make sure that they've got the most current revision of those moto sheets. I can tell you when that doesn't work, when a new moto was created or something was edited and we forgot to refresh all of the sheets that are in staging, it can make a great deal of mess. And most importantly, they need space. This can be hard at some existing tracks, especially a local track that suddenly gets a big event and they suddenly have more riders than they're used to dealing with. But staging a larger race takes a lot of space to do so. A lot of our smaller races, the tracks are well suited to handle the riders that are there. But should it become a bigger event, we need to take up as much space as we possibly can. So when we talk about some of the critical roles, one of the most important is our team leader. So they're responsible for the coordination of the entire staging team. They're there to make sure that everybody understands their role, is able to perform their role, and looks for any of the problems that come along with it. So they need to be in constant contact with the start commissaire, or we call them COM3. They need to have a radio so that they can talk to each other. They need to be able to provide updates back and forth as to what's going on and what the challenges are. Ideally, a staging team lead is not tied to one of those fixed positions that we saw on our layout. This allows them to move around and do troubleshooting and correct things as they go around. If the number of people you have is such that you're forced to have them in a fixed position, ideally it's a position where they can see both the entrance to the staging and the exit to the start hill. And so that might be, as an example, the exit to the staging lanes. And so they might be the one controlling the release of the riders from the staging lanes to the buffer area or to the back of the start hill. It allows them to have control over the pace and be able to be within relatively close walking distance to kind of either end of the staging area. And ideally, a staging team leader is experienced and they are aware of what to look for as to problems that are building, and so they can deal with them before they become a big problem. So if the speaker isn't working and the riders aren't hearing their call for their staging time, if the fences are breaking down, or if there's a marshal or a volunteer in the staging area that's struggling to read the staging sheets, they can move and fix those things quickly. So if we look at some of the individual positions in the area, now when I list out these roles, in many cases they can end up being combined. So for example, we need to have somebody that has the public address system, that is on a microphone with a speaker that can call categories into the pens. Now that might be the same person that's doing our pre-staging entry. So they're one of these two stars here on the right-hand side that are basically at the gate coming into the pre-staging pen. We're looking for those people to do some equipment and clothing checks, to take a scan over the rider and make sure everything looks to be right. Make sure that the riders, we found all the riders from the moto sheets, and if we're missing somebody, they can relay that to the PA announcer, or like I said, it might be the same person and they can continue to call for individual riders to come in. Once we have them in the pen and we've started to get them sorted, we need somebody that's actually calling them out of that pen, passing them to the staging area or the staging lanes, and doing that by gate position. So Moto 10, plate number 12, your position 1, let's move forward. And as well as, again, these riders are going through very slowly, and we have an opportunity to do so, they might be doing an additional equipment check just to make sure they don't spot anything that might have previously been missed. We get to the staging lanes themselves. So we've got riders stacked into neat rows. So obviously we've got somebody directing them into the correct lane. So Moto 12, you're going down lane 2. Again, I mentioned you might have ropes that, you know, prevent people from going on in without direction. So you might have somebody there moving a rope around. We get them lined up neatly in their lanes, and then we need to have somebody that's exiting them out. So again, this is maybe the last chance before they go up the hill and it's kind of too late to make sure that everything's correct and they can get anything fixed. Make sure that we control when they go out. I've seen systems where, you know, you've got riders all lined up and they're all anxious to go and they get maybe confused as to which heat has just gone and they roll out of the pen because somebody moved and the whole heat goes up and they're in the wrong order going up the back of the hill. So it's important that somebody is there making sure the right moto, and they check them off, that all the riders in that heat were released and they go up the hill. On the back side of the hill, so this is kind of going up to the gate itself. Again, if it's a layout where they've actually filtered into their gate positions as they go up that hill, we need to make sure they go into the right lanes. We need somebody to make sure that they're staying in their heat and they don't overlap, meaning a rider rolls up into the heat in front of them or falls back into the heat behind them, I suppose, and finds themselves in the wrong space. And again, depending on the size and depending on the space, this could be multiple people or it could be, you know, 1 or 2 people. And lastly, we were dealing with the gate itself. So ideally, you have somebody that's behind the gate. So this is the person that's, you know, bringing them off the back of the hill, getting them lined up exactly behind their start gate position, provides them with a reminder to get all their equipment ready because they're going to drop in the gate and go. It's not the time when they get there. They can, again, look for any mechanical issues. Does somebody have a flat tire that they're not aware of? Do we need to make some adjustment and maybe pull that moto aside because they need to deal with that before we can release them? And again, looking to make sure that everybody that's supposed to be there is there and we don't have any extras that belongs there. And then of course, when the gate comes back up and it's ready to receive that heat, they give them that instruction to roll into it. And then we need to have somebody in front of the gate. Quite often, this may be the start commissaire or our COM3 as we call them. They're there to make sure that once that gate is loaded, that the gate is loaded correctly. Are all the riders in the right position? Have we checked them off on our staging sheet to confirm that we saw them in those positions? Is there any missing or extra riders? And have we radioed that through to the finish? The missing riders, for example. So if we have a did not start, that gets radioed through to the finish. If there's a rider that doesn't belong, let's get them out now before the gate drops and now we've got a problem. And as you can imagine, at race pace, all of this happens very quickly. So again, having more people involved means that they have a smaller job, less things to do in those few seconds before a gate drops. So we talked about what the staging team members could look like and what's each of their responsibilities in the areas as they go through. So the last thing I want to bring up is kind of summarizing some of these things and some of the things that, you know, work well in a good staging system. So what are we looking for best practices? And ideally, what we're trying to build is a staging system that's efficient and one that is very, I use the word robust, you know, able to handle different challenges, whether that's larger groups or weather or things that could impede a racetrack. So let's talk about it. I mentioned it a few times about space. Staging takes up space. Think of a 6-lane highway versus a 2-lane road. You know, the more space you have, the more free flowing things are, the easier it is to move around for both riders and officials. Many of us that have been in races have tried to go through staging, and you get a handlebar in the hip and a chain grease on your ankle, and it's very difficult. So if we've got space, let's use it and try to identify where we can expand things to. Many of you know excellent staging team members, and it's where we rely on them to go to that position every race. These are the people that are calm, they're organized, they can remain unflappable, meaning they don't get excited, they don't get upset. Staging is very stressful. Everybody is excited about racing. They're trying to hear, they're trying to get themselves ready to go. It's a big crowd, and our people that we can put back there need to be able to handle that. And many of us have seen those that do it well, and unfortunately, we've probably also seen some that aren't able to handle that as well and be able to maintain calm, open communication. It's best if staging is set up before practice even begins. And the reason for that is to train the riders of how the staging layout works, so we can bring them through that layout during practice. Now, we won't necessarily have all of those control points in place where we're stopping riders and sorting them and moving them around, but at least the riders can then see where those areas are and get familiar with what they would be doing when they go into racing. So if they know where the entrance to staging is to get to the track, that's the entrance they're always going to use. Rather than if we had a special entrance for practice and then they show up for their staging, they can't figure out how to get to the opening. You need a very good public address system. The bigger the race, the further you need to be able to spread that. You know, very large races with big pit areas, we actually put speakers through the pits so that the person calling them to staging can be heard throughout the pit area. In smaller events, of course, you don't need that, but of course, still being able to keep people informed of what's next so they can hear clearly and they don't misunderstand when their staging opportunity comes up. Again, sometimes having additional megaphones or other speakers through the system allows our staging people to save their voice. You know, quite often they're going to be yelling quite loudly or speaking loudly, calling numbers and individuals and heats. So if they had a way to project their voice without screaming over a long weekend, that's helpful. In a lot of places, it's important to understand how long the riders are going to be in staging and provide them cover or shade if possible. Sometimes it's also important to make sure that the staging timing is such that riders don't spend too much time in it, in the sun or exposed. So if you've got a system that's working very, very quickly and efficiently, you can get riders in and out without them spending hours sitting in the sun waiting for their race, which obviously is very detrimental to their performance. Make sure we have the current revision of the moto sheets. I mentioned this before. If a change happens, a rider name gets dropped, they get pulled from that moto, or a moto category gets redrawn and the heats get changed, it's very important that everybody in staging has the same version and that they're the very first people to get those new versions so that they can be right on top of it and right up to date. We need to keep that express lane clear. Riders or other marshals or junk can find their way in there, toolboxes and things like that. We need to keep it open so we can get riders back and forth and staff back and forth through that area. I mentioned the idea of hard fencing in the staging lanes, and it's very critical there, but it's even useful elsewhere within the area. If your budget allows or your layout allows, most definitely look to ways to reinforce and build structure around that staging area. There's a lot of people going in and out of there. It's very easy for someone to break a simple ribbon or move a cone, and then things get kind of funny because suddenly you're missing a lane and you don't know where the riders have come from or gone. So providing some of that structure is important. Ways to control entrance and exit from each one of these positions. So quite often we're talking about like a simple little rope across the end of it or a strap. But ideally, you have the ability to stop and start riders as they move through staging, rather than kind of letting them find their own way through. invariably they'll be distracted or they'll get excited about something and they'll move through and find their way into the wrong spot. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about equipment inspection and staging's role in that. So I'll ask Andreas to bring up our final poll of the day. And the question I have is, what is the appropriate penalty that would be applied to an equipment or clothing infraction that was discovered in staging? Is that a verbal warning where you advise the rider that they need to get it fixed and proceed from there? Is it a formal written warning, or could it possibly be a relegation where their scoring is adjusted? Excellent. We'll get Jace to pull that up. Exactly right. As the vast majority of you said, the best case is a verbal warning. Now, there's some reasons for that, and I'll go into what we're looking at here. So when we talk about inspections in staging, this is not a formal equipment inspection. We're not breaking out the measuring tapes and the calipers and checking components on the bicycle. This is where we're looking for any infringement that we notice and making sure it gets fixed before they enter staging or before they get through staging. At this point, we can give the rider advice that, look, you know, you've got the wrong jersey on, the number plate is incorrect, you know, that you need to adjust your shin pads or your pants to go down to your ankle, and we can send them away and have them get it fixed. And at this point, there is really no harm. You know, we're just giving them advice, they get it fixed, they come back, we're all good. And it doesn't impact the rider's event at all. However, if they were to get through staging with that error in place and get onto the racetrack and one of our track marshals or track officials noticed the infraction, there would be a larger penalty implied. It could be a relegation, it could be an official warning. And as for those of us that were here on Friday morning, if you have more than 2 written warnings or formal warnings in an event, you could be disqualified. So what we're trying to do is help the riders correct those errors, often unintentional, before they have a serious impact to their weekend. Now, it is not the responsibility of the staging team to make sure everything is 100% perfect. If a rider goes out onto the racetrack and doesn't have their gloves, or is missing, doesn't have their helmet strap done up, or is wearing a rainbow jersey and is not a world champion, that's not the staging team's fault. It's still the rider's responsibility. But as officials that are trying to develop and train our riders to ascend to higher levels, we can provide them that assistance by taking care of that for them. So what we're asking the staging officials to do, and we're asking them to do it because the riders are going through in a much more controlled manner and slower pace than out on the track. So we're looking for safety equipment first and foremost. Do they have their helmet? Do they have the gloves and pants that are required? Are they able to protect themselves? Do we have control of cameras? So for example, they may be allowed during practice, they have to be mounted to advisor, they're not allowed during competition, so on. Do we know where those are? Can we find them? And of course, as these cameras get smaller, they're harder and harder to spot, especially out on the track at speed. Do we have the right numbers? Are their number plates clear? Do they have the right number on it? When we talk about permanent career numbers, do they have the career number on the back of their jersey? Do people that don't need to have numbers, do they have those by mistake, and can that be fixed? Can they do that now, again, before they get to the track? And in some of our larger races, you know, our national championships, or even if those of you that find their way to larger races, do they have that, find your way to a race where a world champion might show up? Do they have the right jersey as per the regulations? Are they riding as a part of a national team and have to have a national team jersey? Do they have the sleeve of a national champion if they are one? Do they have the world champion jersey? And going through and being able to do this in staging, where you have the ability to stop and talk to the rider, explain where they may have gone wrong, give them an opportunity to leave, fix it, come back before anything else happens, means that we can maintain that flow and prevent the rider's day from being impacted by something as minor as forgetting something simple. So yeah, so those are the ways that we've talked about of maintaining an efficient staging system. I hope some of these tips were helpful to you and allow you to better understand what goes on in that chaos behind the start hill that some of us don't see much during the race day.